So, hi, Rosemary Parkinson. I came across your work in an article about subtle and covert abuse, and I am fascinated by the research you're doing to sort of gather the mentions of this in publications, and what grew your interest in this topic, and let's just define our terms first. What is subtle and covert abuse in a
Well,
relationship?
well, actually, that was the question really that the research that I've done that you've seen was trying to answer. Because I'm a therapist, I'm a psychotherapist, and I've worked with women for nearly 30 years now. But what I started to notice was that a lot of women were arriving for therapy. They were feeling depressed, they were feeling anxious, they thought they were bad people.
Mhm.
And they had no idea that this had anything to do with their relationship. And it was only over the first few sessions that I started to realize, actually, this is not to do with them. This is to do with something that's being done to them. And so I embarked on a doctorate to investigate it further, because it seemed like there was very little in the public sphere or in the academic sphere that I found on this topic, which seemed extraordinary to me, given the number of women that I was seeing who were experiencing this. So the paper that you're referring to, that you came across my research, is what's called a scoping review, which is
Right.
just where you start looking at what literature is out there in the academic field, really, that has saying anything about subtle abuse. And there was very minimal literature, but it was across quite a large amount of time. So over 30 years, there have been little drips in the literature saying, yes, this is it being experienced on a subtle level, but we don't really know very much about it. But, it doesn't look great. Um, so what what my research was trying to do was kind of tease out from the papers that had looked at it what it was.
Right.
And it was quite a magical process, actually, because I was looking at stuff in all sorts of different countries and different time points. And I was thinking, how is this going to work? Am I actually going to get something that's going to cohesively come together? And I did. And so what I was able to do was to find out that subtle or covert abuse, as I looked at in this particular paper, is something which, so there's an underlying attitude, and that could be a societal attitude or an individual attitude. The papers, the works included seem to indicate it could be either or both. And that sparks behaviors in individual men in most of the research. There was some other research, but most of the research was focused on abuse conducted by men on women in intimate relationships.
In heterosexual relationships,
Um,
or
I
mostly.
think I think they were mostly heterosexual. What happened was a lot of the literature didn't really specify.
Right.
So but I think, yeah, most of the literature, particularly historically, has been focused on heterosexual relationships, yes.
About men coercively or subtly control
Yeah, the
women.
term coercive is, it was used by some, but it's not. I mean, there are some issues with definition of that, and particularly now it's embedded in law. So I've been using the term subtle abuse because that seemed to be kind of the most useful thing for clients that I was seeing.
Well, let me ask you a question. So when you would have a client that you were suspecting was a victim of covert and subtle abuse, would you invite the partner into the room to meet them? And would that partner sometimes um, show up as just a person that, if you didn't know the things that were happening, would seem normal?
That's not my experience because I don't see couples.
Mhm.
The research indicates that it's not a good idea to have couples together or with couples where abuse is occurring of whatever kind, which is in a controlling way. So no, I didn't do that. But in my clinical work, I did see men, and there were some men who were coming in who were clearly presenting to me with all the things which I was hearing from other women who were in relationships. And that was very interesting. That's a whole nother study.
Right, right. Okay, okay.
Maybe I'll get started on that next.
Well, so let's just what I want to do is go to sort of the basic idea of this. So a woman comes into your office and she's telling you a story.
Yeah.
Give me an example of a story without, revealing your clients themselves, but what would be a typical story in your mind that would represent subtle or covert abuse?
I think it's very hard to give an anecdotal, what I mean as a specific incident.
Mhm.
I'm going to be touching here on some of the research that I've conducted
Right.
myself subsequently. This isn't all in the paper that you found, so we're sort of moving a little bit into other stuff. But what I have found is that it's about a pervasive attitude on the part of the perpetrator, which affects the victim on a pervasive, ongoing way.
Mhm.
So it's sort of embedded in how that the perpetrator is behaving, or the man is behaving towards the woman in this entitled way. So it can be done in positive ways. So, oh, you're just so much better at, looking after the children than I am. Or it can be done in negative ways, just by becoming moody, so the victim, the woman who's the victim, is behaving in just a normal way. She might be kind of decide she's going to sit and read a magazine, and then suddenly there's this atmosphere and she realizes, okay, this is not great. I think I better stop this. And also on bigger things, women were sort of describing how partners would encourage them to work. They would want a kind of lifestyle that maybe the men weren't prepared to work to have happen. And the women would be trying to make the men happy, because there's a certain amount of belief, in a relationship, we want to make the other person happy. They're
Right.
not happy. What can I do to help that? So they would perhaps be working harder. They might be engaging in work that was quite time consuming, quite hard. And they would be pushing themselves in a way that the men weren't. And one of the things that I found in this subsequent research was that there is this pervasive self-centered attitude in the parts of the men, and it comes out in all sorts of really subtle ways. I mean, some of my participants were talking about, and this sounds really strange, but men becoming ill,
Oh, yeah.
in ways that somehow meant that the women then had to pick up. And I'm not talking about man flu. I'm talking about kind of really weird, oh, I just don't really feel up to doing X, or
Right.
even kind of ending up with it sounds ridiculous, but there was a kind of constant sort of discussion about these sort of avoidant behaviors that the men could engage in.
Yes, I've experienced that myself, so I know
Okay.
exactly what you're talking about.
Okay.
And it's hard to describe too, but it's just this kind of coming home to a man who's sitting there, ah, in this state of, I can't, I won't, you've got to take over. Oh, oh, dinner, oh, that kind of attitude of you have to, the woman has to be to hold up the world on her shoulders, whereas he can just kind of relax into whatever he was feeling or doing or being ill in his own way.
Yeah, so that's come out more about from my later research. That wasn't so evident in the literature review that I
Right.
conducted, because no one has actually, before I did it, no one's actually explored subtle abuse in a research way. all of the work that was included in this literature review that we're talking about, none of that had focused solely on people who'd experienced subtle abuse. None of that had tried to find out what is this thing. So my subsequent research has done that, and hopefully at some point we'll have a chance to chat about that.
Well, I would love to chat about that too. So if we are going to define subtle abuse, what are some of the hallmarks of it? I know in the paper it said avoidance, and so what are they?
Well, the three kind of areas of behavior that I found were limiting, undermining was the first one that I defined. Second one was limiting, and the third one was withholding. So if you think about a perpetrator, most of their behaviors being able to be captured by those things. So that it would be undermining things that they're saying, that they're doing, but all on a very subtle basis. Limiting things were quite interesting, and that sort of goes right into even the way that the woman's thinking. So that the man is, I suppose this comes a little bit under gaslighting type of behaviors. So saying things that would be undermining them, but then that kind of consequently limits how they think about themselves, other people, and also even just stopping them thinking about things because their time is so much taken up with looking after this person, looking after the lives they've created together that he says he wants, but perhaps isn't playing a full part in.
Right.
So limiting what's happening inside herself and also limiting how she's behaving elsewhere, because if you're putting an awful lot of effort into keeping the home and getting the work, and then you haven't got a huge amount of time for fulfilling maybe your needs.
Right.
And then the withholding, that could be on the sort of subtle level of moodiness, like I was mentioning earlier, or emotional withdrawal. One of the papers said that that actually emotional neglect was one of the most upsetting things for women. You're in a relationship where you're expecting some kind of reciprocity of emotion giving, and you're getting nothing back. And that moment you describe of coming home and them sitting there going, oh, do you know, I just haven't got it in me. Now, as you said that, I felt my heart sink, because it is that, isn't it? So, okay, I'll step up again today.
Right. Once again, and again, hold up the world with my shoulders. Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
completely. Now, can withholding also include sexual withholding?
Yes, yes. So in my more recent research that I conducted myself, there were some participants who talked about sexual withholding and criticism, subtle criticism, as part of the process, but also some who felt pushed into sexual activity that they didn't particularly want. So it works both ways. And I think if you come back to that central idea of it coming from a pervasive self-centered attitude, a pervasive sense of some sort of entitlement, whether that's based in society or based in the individual, then it's easy to see how it can manifest in these different, sometimes opposing ways.
Yeah. I mean, here in the United States right now, there was a rapid rise in the phrase "get back to the kitchen" right before Trump was elected. And so I'm also thinking about this in terms, a societal terms, of this subtle and covert abuse that women, experience often enough, but under this new regime, I will call it, we are probably going to be experiencing it a lot more, because if society is saying to women, get back in the kitchen, we should have repealed the 19th, your body, my choice. And we're hearing that over and over again. And we're seeing signs. I mean, that gives men permission to act this way in their own personal relationships as well. And what I'm actually fascinated by is this idea of the abuse being covert, because a lot of times when I hear from friends about covert abuse, they get out of a bad relationship or they divorce, and they tell me what was really going on in the marriage. Oftentimes that couple was seen as sort of a lovely couple, and in at a dinner party, you would have never expected it. Now there is abuse that you see very clearly where the man is undermining the woman in public,
Yeah,
oh, rolling his eyes. I mean, that
yeah.
is not covert. But the covert nature of this, I know that I experienced that both in my marriage and in my subsequent post-marital relationship, that this, if I would have asked any of my friends, they would have thought, oh, they have a fine relationship, they're madly in love. How, and even to the point of being able to hide that from the couples therapist. So how are you, when you have a client in your office, when is the point where you realize, oh, wait a minute, this is covert abuse? Is there kind of a turning point?
I think so. This is actually what my research's main focus eventually was, but I had to do so much background stuff because it hadn't
Right.
been done before. Is therapist recognition, is how can a therapist recognize when someone comes in and they're suffering some subtle abuse? It's not actually their stuff that we're needing to look at, it's what's going on, what's being done to them. And the therapists that I spoke to for that, and the women I spoke to who'd been to therapists, there did seem to be, it needed to be a gradual process of understanding, because the client comes in saying it's one thing and you're discovering later it is something else, that of course you're going to kind of go with where they are at when they come
Right.
in. So it's over time. And the key thing that was in my research was this, was a sense of incongruence.
Mm-hmm.
So congruence is in the experience in the relationship. There's a mismatch often between, he might say he loves me, but I don't feel loved.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then there's an incongruence in the way that the women talk to the therapist. So they'll be saying, oh, he's lovely, we've got a great relationship. And then there'll be little things which they're saying, which the therapist is thinking, that doesn't sound
So
so great.
lovely.
uh, and the women sort of, there's a sort of tension between the fact that they sort of know maybe something isn't completely right, but they don't want to say that, and there are all sorts of reasons why that might be. And then the therapists themselves can start to feel an incongruence because they want to speak up and say, so this doesn't feel right, but they feeling a pressure from the woman to not say that. So they're being silenced themselves. So there are a number of different layers of incongruence. And I think one of the things that I've said in my research is most useful for therapists is paying attention to the feelings that they're having themselves.
Oh, that's really interesting. So the therapist has to actually feel what's going on in the room, feel their own incongruence, and
Yeah,
then really understand that this may be an incongruence in the person's
yeah, yeah.
relationship itself. Now, a side question to all this, have you found that women who are often victims of this type of subtle and covert abuse, that they were somehow had grown up in trauma themselves as children? Is there a typical victim of subtle and covert abuse, or is it widespread and it's universal that the woman's background and the way that she grew up or the way that she was raised by her parents plays no role whatsoever, that it's just sometimes a bad choice?
Hmm. We don't know that. I mean, the evidence is very conflicted on that. What seemed to be coming out in my research was that there were some beliefs, some assumptions in people that there was something to do with your background, which made you more likely. But one of my participants, who was both a therapist and a victim of subtle abuse, captured it really nicely when she said that she holds both perspectives, because on the one hand, she knows that perpetrators are really good at this,
Yeah.
and we know that, if you look at grooming as a concept, that people can very carefully, very subtly over time end up, making people do the opposite of what they want to do. So she said she holds that in mind at the same time as holding in mind that she was in quite a vulnerable place. She's been a striving person growing up, and maybe some of these things contributed to how she dealt with it. I think I didn't ask people about their history in the interview. That wasn't relevant for my research question. But I did ask them about responsibility for the abuse. And there were a lot of confused people at that point. Because I think, well, I think society is giving quite a lot of messages that, you know, maybe there is a responsibility for the individual. But what they were saying was, well, if I saw this happening in someone else, I'd say nothing to do with you. You're being abused. This is bad. You need to take no responsibility yourself. But in myself, I start to look for reasons why. So this was what the participants were saying. And some of them changed during the interview. So they would say, I don't really like using the word abuse, or I don't really think that, you know, there was 6 of one, half a dozen of the other kind of thing. And then later on in the interview, they start going, well, in this abuse, because that's what it is. I ought to just start using the word. And this was something that was done to me. How much responsibility I take is actually, no, this isn't my fault. This was done to me. So it was really interesting seeing that change in the interview. And I might write up something about that later as well.
Well, I will even say that the reason I wanted to interview you is reading your work unlocked something in me. I mean, I'm in a wonderful, thank goodness, relationship right now, but I had 2 long-term, you know, a 23-year marriage and a 4-year post-marital relationships that match everything you wrote. And it really was a wake-up call to me to be able to say to myself, oh, that was abuse, even though it was subtle, even though it was covert, even though nobody else except for me saw it.
Yeah, yeah.
And you know, I don't know if you had in your country the Sesame Street, but Sesame Street had this character called Snuffleupagus, and
Right.
Snuffleupagus was only seen by Big Bird, and anytime somebody else would come into the picture, Snuffleupagus would disappear, and Big Bird would say, "Well, but Snuffleupagus was just here." And then I actually spoke to somebody very recently who worked on Sesame Street. And apparently, after I grew up and younger kids were watching Sesame Street, children who were being abused were having a really hard time with the Snuffleupagus. So that Sesame Street, when they started allowing other characters to see Snuffleupagus, it allowed these children who were being abused at home to finally speak up and
That's
say, I'm
so,
being abused.
yeah.
And in many ways, I keep thinking of, I know it's so crazy, but you know, Sesame Street, but I keep thinking about Snuffleupagus in terms of your work, because it's the hidden part of it that is really so detrimental. And it is the inability to define, for me at least, it was the inability to define what was happening, right?
You can't put your finger on it. That's the thing. You kind of keep, even me, having done all this research. I mean, I've spent years seeing clients. I've spent 5 years doing my doctorate.
Yeah.
And yet when we came to, I was thinking about us talking today, I was thinking, well, what can I actually say? What are the examples that I can use? And it starts to slip through your fingers.
Yes. It's like water. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, anyway, I really, really appreciate you speaking with me today. Stay on, please, because I want to talk to you afterwards. But I think this will be very helpful to many, many women who are experiencing all manner of abuse. And I don't want to even put it in quotes, but
No, no.
abuse that is not physical and not necessarily seen by others, but real nonetheless. And I thank you
Well,
for your research.
oh, thank you for giving me a sort of a space to talk about it. I'm really hopeful that actually naming it,
Yeah.
like you said, with a snuffleupagus,
Yeah.
will give people something to hang on to. Go, oh, there is a thing. This isn't just something that maybe here I feel this and maybe I don't, and oh, I can't put my finger on it, and it's probably me. Then, you know, there's a thing now. People can say, oh, maybe this is subtle abuse. Maybe I'm experiencing subtle abuse. And with the definition that's in this paper that's now out, and it's open access, so anyone can read this
Great. Yeah.
literature review that I've written with my co-authors. Anyone can read that. And then I'm hoping to be able to publish my own research within the next year, which will go into much more detail about what exactly is subtle abuse. And we've touched on it today, and how it can be recognized. So I'm really hoping that all of those things will mean that women are able to say, yes, that is something, that is a real thing. And now I've got a name for it.
Well, I literally have several people in mind as you're talking, friends of mine who will remain unnamed, that I know are experiencing this right now. And,
I'm
to be able
afraid.
to like maybe just send them that article, your article
Yeah.
would be very useful. All right, I'm going to press stop on the recording. Hold on one
Okay.
second. Stop recording.